Okay, so a little while ago I did a few episodes with ex-Mortal Kombat actor Daniel Pesina. For those of you who don't know, Daniel Pesina was the original actor that played Johnny Cage, Scorpion and Sub-Zero in the video games. And I more or less had an intro video that kind of showcased my custom-made Mortal Kombat machine. So I got a few questions about the arcade machine. Now yes, it was a custom build. I'd put it together probably about 20 years ago now. Before making those Daniel Pesina videos, I pretty much had it in the corner just gathering dust. And it hadn't been switched on for at least maybe 15 years before doing those episodes. I gave it a good clean before filming, replaced the old monitor with an LCD that I had lying around, and pretty much cleaned up half a dead mouse that was left in there. So I'm assuming that mouse was in there for a while. So in this episode, let's go through my restoration of the cabinet and the things I encountered and the conclusion. Stick with me, tell me what you think, let's go. So as you can see, it's a pretty simple sort of looking arcade machine. It's not as fancy as the original Mortal Kombat arcade machine, but again, this was a custom project that I was working on back in 2003, 2004. So with the curiosity, I figured that I'd make a video for you guys, just to document how the original build came about. And sure enough, after doing those Mortal Kombat videos, I figured that perhaps it was time to give the arcade cabinet a bit of a makeover, a bit of a change, and I'll document that in this episode as well. I mean, you know, like a change is as good as a holiday. Maybe put some new artwork on the cabinet, change the controls around a little bit, and it'll be doing it with you guys. First up, yes, it is a Mame emulator cabinet. Now this was a pretty new sort of concept, especially back in 2003, 2004. More or less, inside the cabinet is an old PC, and that PC is running the Mame emulator, amongst other emulators as well. The cabinet itself was an original Street Fighter arcade cabinet from the 1990s. It needed a lot of work to get into the condition that it's in now. Okay, so let's start with what the original idea was. It was the early 2000s and I was unemployed. I had a lot of time on my hands. I was working on a Marvel website at the time, which was probably one of the biggest Marvel websites on the internet. It was more or less kind of a digital version of the Marvel Universe handbooks from the 80s. But to occupy my time with other things as well, I thought that I would restore an old arcade cabinet. Okay, first up, from what you can see, this is what it looked like when I brought it home. It had the original marquee on the top, said latest games. Now again, these are really low res pics because it was the early 2000s and I didn't really have a good camera at that time. Remember, the bezel had a lot of just circles. Okay, these are the original coin slots, 40 cents. One of them wasn't quite so clear, so I kept the one and I actually put that back onto the cabinet when I restored it. I used one of the original globes from the cabinet to light up the coin slot here that was hooked up to the actual PC. Now the original arcade cabinet that I wanted was the lowboy model. Now in Australia, the lowboy model was something that you saw from the 80s, even up until the late 90s. Now you'd find those units in arcades as well as fish and chip shops and anywhere else that somebody could put an arcade machine in the corner. Now it was quite short, the screen almost faced upwards, they came in different colours, but the most common one that I recall was the wood grain effect down the sides. And you could almost smell the greasy hands that had been all over these things, you know. So at that time in my life, the only time that I could acquire something like this was probably on eBay. And could you imagine what the freight costs would have been? Now because of the rarity of people actually looking for old burnt out cabinets, it was a hard thing to come by. And seeing my location in the world, there was only one place where I could physically get to where I could have a look at some of these old burnt out cabinets and possibly purchase one. And that was a place, no longer around, called Bumper Amusements. And from what I understand, a place that has since gone bankrupt and owed a lot of people money. My experience with Bumper Amusements was, shall I say, a little bit negative. And over time, unfortunately, there were a lot of negative encounters that I had during the building of this cabinet. Bumper Amusements is probably the first one. I made the best of these situations, and in the end, even though with all the negativity, I ended up with something that was positive. So back to Bumper Amusements. On the ground floor, they had a showroom that had brand new pinball machines, or refurbished pinball machines as well. These ranged from the awesome Kiss pinball machine, the original one, all the way to things like the Incredible Hulk, the Playboy one. Although pinball wasn't really my forte, it was still nice to see. On the second floor, they had their service centre, where they'd be fixing pinball machines and fixing arcade cabinets. One of which I spotted there being a lowboy, just like the one that I wanted. A little further in on that second floor was pretty much a graveyard of old arcade cabinets. This included the old skill tester machines. I saw the old Simpsons arcade machine there, which is also referred to as a Goliath because of its size. The artwork was all stripped from the sides. It was terrible. And obviously the shell to my cabinet was there as well. I think they had about 2 of them. Now, because it was the early 2000s, not a lot of people had heard of or understood the concept of what a Mame cabinet was. In fact, there were still a lot of people that didn't really understand what video game emulation was yet. For those of you who aren't aware, video game emulation is a way to preserve old video games from old systems. It's a way that you can replay old games. The legalities are all over the place with this concept, but that's what emulators are. Mame emulates the old arcade games. And the idea was, what if we had one of these PCs running that emulator inside an arcade cabinet? So that was the idea. You know, we had forums on the internet at the time. There wasn't a huge number of people doing this. And for the people that ran Bumper Amusements, well, they had never heard of this idea before and they looked at me like I was crazy. I pointed this out to one of those techs that was working on that lowboy cabinet, and he said to me, "You can't fit a PC in this." I thought to myself, what the hell are you talking about? Of course you can fit a PC in a lowboy. I mean, sure, it was the early 2000s and PC cases were still pretty big, but of course you could fit one in there. He just couldn't see it being done. I said, well, that's fine, whatever. Gone into this graveyard of arcade machines and I pretty much selected this tall cabinet. And I remember these cabinets back in the 90s. They used to line them all up. They'd have different games on them. They were interchangeable. And it was an absolute mess. It had water damage down the sides, but the controls, I mean, look at them, they're an absolute mess as well. Who modifies and puts buttons on a cabinet that look like this? Were they drunk? Now also take note of the Australasian Joysticks. These were the joysticks that I grew up with, being in Australia. You can see they look a lot different to the Japanese standard joysticks and the American standard joysticks. And they're quite a comfortable joystick. I always really enjoyed these. So I can't remember what I paid for it, a couple of $100. I thought it was a bit steep for the piece of shit that it was. So when I said to the guy, could you possibly drop the price a little bit? His comment to me was, if you don't buy it, the next person will. Wow, thanks. Fuck you too. And unfortunately, there was no other place that I could obtain an arcade cabinet, and while my woodworking skills are pretty crap, I accepted. I moved my station wagon around the back, loaded it in, and it was all cool. Look, this was something that probably since I was a kid, I'd always wanted to own anyway. So even though it was a piece of junk, I was still happy. Opened it up, it looked like it hadn't been opened for a very long time. The amount of spiders, and I'm not talking about little spiders, I'm talking about your typical venomous Australian spiders. There were quite a few nests, shall we say, located inside the crevices to this machine. And a lot of bug spray was used. I spent the entire afternoon just taking the guts out of this machine. And I reckon there would have been about 300 different screws in there. The coin box was in there, the coin chute. Underneath some of the aged equipment was an operator's manual for Street Fighter 2. So that was pretty cool. For some reason, I don't know where that manual has gone, which kind of sucks, but I did get a photo of it, so that's cool. So my project had begun, and it was something that I'd never done before. I'm not well versed in woodwork and things like that. I'm no handyman by any stretch of imagination. So this whole project was a new thing for me, and I enjoyed it. So this was just after I gave it its first sand to the side. As you can see, there was quite a lot of water damage, a lot of expanded sort of chipboard. So I had to sand it down several times. Gave it its first undercoat at this point. This was the basic skeleton or shape of the cabinet once it was all cleaned up. So again, not being all that well versed in my woodworking and even my electrical type stuff, I wasn't exactly going to put one of those old school tube monitors into this thing. Because, well, I'd probably shock the living hell out of myself, Ace Frehley style. My original plan was to put a PC monitor in here. Now also, early 2000s, PC monitors still sucked. They were tubes, they were huge, they were heavy, and the screen size was still small. So I had to cut away at the existing sort of setup in here, and well, these are straps. Quite strong weight-bearing straps, and they were going to hold the monitor in place. Now as you can see, the cabinet itself is an odd sort of shape. Never did manage to find out what the name of this type of cabinet was. Again, because from what I understand, this was an Australian only sort of model. I don't think people overseas really saw this particular shape of arcade cabinet. I could be wrong. I do know that there were some Neo Geo cabinets that had a similar shape to this, but people are more well versed in the different shapes of arcade cabinets like this one or that one. So it was something unique. So it was clear that originally in the top of this cabinet, right behind the marquee, was where the mono speaker used to be. So I put in 2 stereo speakers there. New lights, I actually put in work lights, as you can see. Auto shop work lights. So if I wanted to plug them in or unplug them, it was just a simple matter of just doing that. So I didn't need to wire anything up. If I just wanted to plug them into the wall, I could plug them into the wall and get light. If I didn't want them on, they weren't on. It's clear that once a glass and a marquee were put in, that they would muffle the sound, so the speakers eventually moved out of that little crevice there. Wow man, there's my old car in the background. Okay, here is the inside of the revamped control panel. Now, long story with this. At the time of this build, it was quite difficult for people like me to get hold of arcade cabinet parts. Buttons, joysticks, encoders, things of that nature. And not being so good with my wiring and electrical stuff like that as well, I thought it'd probably be a better idea to get a custom-made joystick panel. I mean, it all hooks up to something called a J-Pack or an I-Pack, and it's a keyboard encoder. It's a little card, more or less in a crude sort of description. What it's doing is it's tricking the computer into thinking that these buttons are part of a keyboard. There were only 2 joysticks that I had access to during this time. One was called an X-Arcade joystick, which was pretty cool. It looked like it had all the arcade buttons on it and a joystick, and you plugged it into your USB, I think. It's a long time ago now. But it had graphics all over it, and it was a nice contained box, but it just wasn't suitable for this project. Then there was this website called Ozstick, which is still operating to this day. Good on them. Ozstick is a very praised sort of online shop for joystick parts and buttons and things like that. Unfortunately, whenever I've dealt with them, it hasn't been a pleasant experience. Now that's not to say that other people haven't had pleasant experiences with these guys. In fact, you do a little bit of research and there's nothing but positive things said about these guys. Unfortunately, and again, I don't know why this was the case, whenever I dealt with them, I was left with a kind of negative experience. So, from what I recall, originally, when you went to their website back in 2003, 2004, they advertised that they were more than happy to help out with anybody doing custom sort of builds like this. I needed a custom-made control panel box, obviously to replace that creepy looking one that came with the cabinet. I needed something new, I needed something clean, and I needed something custom made. Simple, a custom made box, the dimensions of this cabinet. How hard could that possibly be? I contacted them by email and I requested, I need these dimensions. And the dimensions of their pre-made box that they had at the time weren't too far off the dimensions that I needed. I simply got an email back saying, no, we can't make it at that length. It's going to have to be this or nothing. And it was literally like half an inch difference. I don't know what, yeah, something like that. And yet they weren't willing to make a custom box that was to my dimensions. So what was I supposed to do? I was stuck. I couldn't install their pre-made existing box on my cabinet, there just wasn't the physical space. I had no choice. I thought, well, I may as well order the box. When it comes along, I can try and edit the existing cabinet, maybe trim the sides off a little bit, and I'll be able to fit the control panel in, who knows. I can't remember how much it wasn't cheap. And when it did arrive, I gave them a thank you and I said, yeah, this is the cabinet that'll be going into. I don't think they really gave a shit. And there's that half little bit that I needed on each side of the cabinet. And sure enough, the way the cabinet was originally built, it had a little sort of section, the controls fit right in. No thanks to Ozstick. The workmanship was quite good. The wiring was great. Have a look at how neat and tidy the wiring is. That's cool. That's fine. You'd think there'd be a bit more quality control in the way it looks on the outside. I mean, pretty much on the side here, take a look at that. This is how it came. There is a big stain, scratch stain, I don't know what you call this, big blemish right down the side. Now, if I bought this specifically just to have it as a box, which is how they sold it to me because they didn't really care that I was building a cabinet here, this would be unacceptable. You would not buy anything like this in a shop. You'd take it straight back. But, because I had better things to do with my time than pursue some shit like this, and it was going to be covered up by the side of the cabinet anyway, I let it go. So as you can see here, this is where I installed my speakers down below. I used the speaker grills from my previous car that were left over with what I salvaged from the coin slot. This was the 40-cent coin slot, and there it is installed. And here's the monitor after I've installed it. As you can see, it looks like it's just dangling there, but it was quite nicely wedged in the wood. Have a look at that monitor. That monitor was way too small for the cabinet, but alas, what could I do, especially during those days? And do you remember how much these things used to cost? And this was the control panel when I first installed it. As you can see, quite a few screws on the side, keeping it in place. So the steel footplate, that was really heavy duty, that was still intact. Clean that up, put that back on. So it came down to the most simplest sort of marquee that I could think of, and I thought, you know what, Mortal Kombat, you couldn't go wrong. Especially Mortal Kombat 1. So I did a bit of artwork here. Got it printed out to the size that I wanted. Also, getting custom made posters during this time was something very rare. It was something of a bother for a lot of printing places too. They just didn't want to deal with you if you were just a small fry. I managed to find some back road sort of printer somewhere. Can't remember what these printers whined about, but they didn't make the process easy. Anyway, they got it done, eventually. So you see how many negative sorts of people that I've encountered so far? Kind of sucks when I look back on it. So many people can be so rude. Anyway, there it was once it was completed. So at that time, my specialty was digital arts, graphics, things like that. I was more than well versed in things such as Flash and Shockwave. Do you remember Shockwave? I knew that lingo inside out. Sure enough, a year after I'd learnt it, it became obsolete. So that was good. Good time learning something that wasn't worth learning. I made my own front end here. Simple as it looks, I wanted it simple. And as soon as the PC would turn on, you could select what you wanted to do, whether you wanted jukebox mode, VCD mode, as you can see. VCDs was still a thing at that time. DVD/VCD. I had information about the cabinet. And obviously game mode. And when you went into game mode, you had a little menu there and you could scroll through which games you wanted and you could play them. Here we are having a look inside the cabinet and check that PC out. Check out that multimedia subwoofer system. Still going strong. That PC is, if I'm not mistaken, a Pentium 3. It's crazy. But it did its job well then and it does its job well now. So as you saw with this video, that was my Mortal Kombat Mark II cabinet. I called it that because, well, it was Mortal Kombat themed and that's how I wanted it. Now, shoot forward 20 years to now. Like I said at the start of this video, a change is as good as a holiday. And this thing needed a change. So, follow me in my next video where we give the Mortal Kombat Mark II cabinet a revamp. As you can see, it's already done. We'll go through it together. We'll get to see the changes, the revamps, the new coin slot, the overall new theme of the cabinet. So, until then, make sure that you join me. See you then.